What's up, guys? Nuance Bro checking in, and today we're going to be talking about Trump's most recent executive order on anti-Semitism and some of the misconceptions around it and some of its potential consequences. So on Wednesday, Trump signed his most recent executive order on anti-Semitism on college campuses. And this executive order invokes Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which protects things like race and national origin, against discrimination on college campuses. So we're first going to start off with some of the misconceptions and some of the alarmist rhetoric around this executive order that started earlier on, and then we'll get to some of the more real potential consequences. So a lot of the outrage originally started when the New York Times put out this article titled "Trump to Sign Order Targeting Anti-Semitism on College Campuses." And if we scroll down, we can see this particular passage which says, "The order will effectively interpret Judaism as a nationality, not just a religion, to trigger a federal law penalizing colleges and universities deemed to be shirking their responsibility to foster an open climate for minority students." So this actually sparked a lot of outrage, it seems, in the Twitter sphere among people who are often Jewish themselves, who said, oh, well, you're redefining Judaism as a nationality. This effect plays into this canard of dual loyalty of people who are Jewish saying they have a loyalty to Israel over the United States, or saying that they're not really American, that Judaism is their nationality, or something like that. You can see tweets like this from Michael Weiss, which says, "So this makes American Jews citizens of which nation then?" And even Democratic presidential candidate Andrew Yang, who said, "Jews are American," implying that this executive order says that they are not American. Now, remember, the New York Times was operating on anonymous sources who were talking about the language of the executive order, but they hadn't seen the actual language of the executive order itself. So later, the language of the executive order leaked, and also, of course, eventually it was signed by President Trump, and it turns out that what they said wasn't 100% correct. So this led the New York Times from changing their original article from this to this. So now that same article says, "Trump targets anti-Semitism and Israeli boycotts on college campuses." And if we scroll down, we can see the main difference being in this second paragraph. So if we looked at the previous article, we can see in that first sentence, for example, where it only talks about their interpretation of Judaism as a nationality, not just a religion. But look at it in the newest article. You can see the paragraph is much longer, and now it mentions it as a race or nationality, not just a religion. And we can see them mentioning the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. Now, we'll get to the BDS movement in just a second, but I just want to say this whole thing about this executive order, originally about the whole redefining it as a nationality thing and saying, oh, they're trying to make the religious aspect a protected category, and that's not really something that's covered under the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and this is the Trump administration going beyond the bounds of its executive authority, but they decided to leave this out. So what we have here is a letter from the Department of Justice in 2010 under the administration of President Barack Obama, and we can see it says this: "At your request and pursuant to the Department of Justice's coordination responsibilities under Executive Order 12250, this letter addresses whether and under what circumstances discrimination against persons belonging to discrete religious groups might violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, as amended, a bunch of, U.S. sections, whatever. Specifically, the question is whether Title VI, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, and national origin, provides protection to Jews, Arab Muslims, Sikhs, and or members of other religious groups. We have also reviewed the September 13th, 2004 letter from the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights, addressing this same question." So now they're going to go on to cite a letter from 2004, which would be under the Bush administration. In its operative paragraph, the September 13th, 2004 letter states, "Groups that face discrimination on the basis of shared ethnic characteristics may not be denied the protection of our civil rights laws on the ground that they also share a common faith. Similarly, the existence of facts indicative of religious discrimination does not divest OCR of jurisdiction to investigate and remedy allegations of race or ethnic discrimination. OCR will exercise its jurisdiction to enforce the Title VI prohibition against national origin discrimination, regardless of whether the groups targeted for discrimination also exhibit religious characteristics. Thus, for example, OCR aggressively investigates alleged race or ethnic harassment against Arab Muslim, Sikh, and Jewish students. And now we get back to the 2010 letter. We agree with that analysis. Although Title VI does not prohibit discrimination on the basis of religion, discrimination against Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and members of other religious groups violates Title VI when that discrimination is based on the group's actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics, rather than its members' religious practice. Title VI further prohibits discrimination against an individual where it is based on actual or perceived citizenship or residency in a country whose residents share a dominant religion or a distinct religious identity. The inquiry into whether a particular act of alleged discrimination falls within the purview of Title VI's prohibitions will, in every case, involve a detailed analysis of the allegations to determine whether jurisdiction is appropriate. So basically what we have here is a letter from 2010 under the Obama administration citing a letter in 2004 from the Bush administration saying that it's already the policy of the Department of Education to enforce Title VI against those who discriminate against certain religious groups if that discrimination is also related to someone's sort of national origin, ethnicity, race, skin color, whatever, even if that's sort of a perceived tie. So for example, we all know that Islam is a religion, but some people decide to associate Islam and Arabs sort of together. So there's this sort of, imagine this sort of ignorant person who says, hey, Muslim, go back to your country, where, Muslim obviously isn't a nationality, it's not a country, it's not a race even, or an ethnicity, although certain groups might disproportionately be Muslim because that's just the nature of things. So they're saying if you sort of discriminate against someone using that sort of failed logic, that is sort of de facto discrimination based on national origin or ethnicity or whatever, and that would be protected under Title VI. So this brings us to some of the real controversies about Trump's executive order and some of the real potential consequences. Because when it comes to Trump's executive order dealing with anti-Semitism on college campuses under Title VI, that was already addressed in 2010 under the Obama administration, citing that 2004 letter. So it's already protected, so why would you even need this executive order in the first place? Well, this is where it gets interesting. So let's take a look at the actual text of the executive order, and we're going to look at a specific section. So we can see here on the whitehouse.gov website, it says Executive Order on Combating Anti-Semitism. And if we scroll down, we can go here under Section 2, and it says, Section 2, Ensuring Robust Enforcement of Title VI. In enforcing Title VI and identifying evidence of discrimination based on race, color, or national origin, all executive departments and agencies charged with enforcing Title VI shall consider the following. The non-legally binding working definition of anti-Semitism adopted on May 26, 2016 by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, IHRA, which states, anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. And the, quote, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, unquote, identified by the IHRA to the extent that any examples might be used as evidence of discriminatory intent. In considering the materials described in subsections A1 and A2 of this section, agencies shall not diminish or infringe upon any right protected under federal law or under the First Amendment. As with other Title VI complaints, the inquiry into whether a particular act constitutes discrimination prohibited by Title VI will require a detailed analysis of the allegations. So the most important part here is actually how they're defining anti-Semitism. And they're using this definition by the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. This was actually the definition of anti-Semitism held by the State Department before this executive order. But what exactly is this definition? Well, let's take a look. So if we go to the US Department of State, where it says defining anti-Semitism, we can scroll down. And here we can see that same definition that was listed in the executive order in section 2. But what's most important, I think, is actually this contemporary examples of anti-Semitism in public life, because that was also cited in the executive order when trying to give context to this working definition of anti-Semitism. So what are some of the examples? Well, it's got a lot of obvious ones that make a lot of sense, but we're going to focus on the ones that could potentially be used in very dishonest ways and don't really necessarily mean something is anti-Semitic. For example, this point right here, which says, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of the state of Israel is a racist endeavor. This basically means if you don't believe in Zionism personally, then you are an anti-Semite. This could potentially mean someone who says the existence of Israel as it exists today, given its current political structure and how they deal with the Palestinians, etc., talking about that in a bad way, talking about its existence in a bad way, is potentially anti-Semitic, or actually is anti-Semitic. Another example here, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. Well, we see people doing that all the time for all types of countries, even including the United States. How many times have we heard that Trump's policy against illegal migrants, for example, is like the treatment of the Nazis of the Jews or something like that? Does that mean people are racist against Trump or American people or whatever? No, it's a criticism of the actions of the state. It's not racist, and it's not racist to do that towards Israel. It's not anti-Semitic. Perhaps it can be, but it's not necessarily. So that's one of the main criticisms against Trump's executive order, employing this very specific definition of anti-Semitism. They believe that it could be so wide as to basically crush any sort of anti-Israel sentiment or any criticism of the state of Israel, separate from any sort of anti-Semitism. Now you might ask yourself, well, what's the proof, Nuance, bro? You're saying this, but what's the proof that this has anything to do with something like the BDS movement, or basically your ability to boycott Israel or speak negatively about the state of Israel? Where's your evidence for that? Well, let's take a look at the actual ceremony that led into the signing of this document, where Trump was actually talking about the need for this executive order. And what did he say?
This is our message to universities. If you want to accept the tremendous amount of federal dollars that you get every year, you must reject anti-Semitism. It's very simple. My administration will never tolerate the suppression, persecution, or silencing of the Jewish people. We have also taken a firm stand against the so-called divestment and sanctions movement, or BDS. You know that very well. And I have to tell you, Jared Kushner and Ivanka, they've been talking to me about this for 3 years now, maybe longer than that. But I go back about 3 years where it's something that I could do about it. You know, in this position, we can do things about it. Before that, not quite as much. I'd be just like you. Successful, doing nicely, but not for this. But they've been talking from the beginning of the administration. They've been bringing this up. And we forcefully condemn this anti-Semitic campaign against the state of Israel and its citizens.
So here you can see Trump actually mentioning the BDS movement in particular and talking about Ivanka and Jared and how they've been bringing this up to him since the beginning of the administration. And he calls it an anti-Semitic movement. Now, granted, you could make the argument that BDS as a movement or a group is anti-Semitic, but these same arguments have been used against people who just maybe they want to boycott Israel in general and they don't believe themselves to be as part of any group like BDS or any sort of radical group or whatever. Maybe they just don't like the treatment that Israel has towards the Palestinians, for example, and they want to boycott that country. Well, now you would be called anti-Semitic for that if you try to do that on a college campus and say maybe you want to stand up for the human rights of Palestinians for whatever reason on a college campus. If you support something like a boycott bill or you advocate for boycotting and the administration doesn't take action against you as a student for advocating for boycotts, which is a First Amendment activity, by the way. We'll get into that in just a bit. But if the administration doesn't take action against a student who advocates for boycotts, or if the student body supports a measure that supports boycotts of Israel, that would be deemed anti-Semitic under this executive order. Because remember, actual anti-Semitism based on sort of, an ethnic perception of Jews or national origin of Jews, things like that, that was already covered under existing interpretations by the Department of Justice, the Department of Education. You saw that in that 2010 letter, which even referenced that 2004 letter. So this has been the policy across many administrations already. So if you think this executive order isn't a big deal and it's kind of just oh, it's just a nice gesture and it kind of just reinforces that existing language that existed before. You know, he just tried to do it in a more official form that was a little more focused on anti-Semitism in particular. Well, listen to Alan Dershowitz, who Trump brought on stage that day, and listen to what he had to say.
For 65 of my 81 years, I have spent at universities all over the country and all over the world. There is no more important event in those 65 years to turn universities away from being bastions of hatred and discrimination than this executive order being signed today. It is a game changer. It will go down in history as one of the most important events in the 2,000-year battle against anti-Semitism. Thank you, Mr. President. You did a great, great job. The people who helped you do this did a great, great job, and you will be remembered by history for all time for having signed this very important order.
So this is a Harvard law professor, and he's saying in the entire 2,000-year history of Jews being persecuted, this executive order in particular will go down as one of the most, devastating blows to anti-Semitism, things like that. So, he's not playing around. He knows what the significance of this executive order is and the impact it could have, crushing the free speech of people who advocate against the state of Israel. So he knows. Also, I just can't resist because this is Alan Dershowitz. Allegations. This guy hung out with Jeffrey Epstein. Maybe not the most trustworthy fellow, I would say. Kind of weird that I don't know why Trump's bringing up these people who have ties to Jeffrey Epstein or just weird, shady. He brought up Robert Kraft as well, which you can see here. Another person who's been arrested recently for, prostitution, things like that. But it's weird. It's weird. On one stage, you have these people. I don't know. That's a bit of a tangent, but I want to get back to this because Trump mentioned here, because he's taking an executive order. Usually these types of things you would expect to go through Congress, through the legislative process. And Trump actually mentions that this sort of stuff had support in Congress almost unanimously, but for whatever reason, it just didn't pass. So now he's going to take executive order, kind of ignoring the legislative process.
So this is a very powerful document that we're signing today, and it's been a very big story over the last number of days when they heard. As you know, they had almost universal support in Congress, and yet they didn't get it done. And this has gone on for years and years. They've almost had universal support, but there was always a roadblock. But this year, there's no roadblock because I'm doing it myself. It's much easier.
So when Trump talks about the legislation, he's talking about bills like this. S-720, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, which was introduced in the 115th Congress, 2017 through 2018. And we could see the bill was only introduced. It never went up for any votes. S-852, Anti-Semitism Awareness Act of 2019. And once again, we can see that it was only introduced, no votes on it whatsoever. But I think the most interesting one is this one. S1, the Strengthening America's Security in the Middle East Act of 2019. And we can see it was introduced, but it was also passed by the Senate. Now, keep in mind, this is S1. That means this was the first bill that the Senate introduced that they even took a vote on, I think, but the first one that they introduced, S1, it's number one on the roster. And their priority in this country was to basically give Israel everything it wants. And if we scroll down, we can see it specifically right here, the Combating BDS Act of 2019. And quickly, I just want to take a look at the votes here and show you guys. So this was the roll call vote. And there were 77 yeas and 23 nays. And I also want to mention for good measure, the only Republican, all Republicans voted for this bill, except for Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. So I have to say, major props to Senator Rand Paul. He seems to be good on most of the issues. But this is really what the executive order is about. It's about crushing the BDS movement, trying to crush any sort of boycotts against the state of Israel. That's why you've seen laws like this passed across many other states. I even did a video, if you guys remember, I'll leave a little link for the video up here, where there was the case in Texas where the woman was a contractor with the state. She was a sole proprietor. She was basically a teacher at a school, and she didn't have her contract renewed because she wasn't willing to sign what was effectively a loyalty pledge to Israel, saying that she wouldn't boycott products from Israel. And we've seen cases even in the state of Texas where people were denied disaster relief fund if they wouldn't sign an effective loyalty pledge to Israel not to boycott their products. And remember, this is straight up unconstitutional. We've already had courts rule against this. For example, you can see here, this is from the website Fire, where you can see the third federal court rules anti-BDS law violates First Amendment. So we know laws that try to prevent boycotts are generally unconstitutional in a First Amendment context because it violates not only freedom of speech, but freedom of association and petition for a redress of grievances, all those rights that are protected under the First Amendment. And it's disappointing because I see a lot of these people who paint themselves as these free speech advocates, these free speech absolutists. People like Donald Trump Jr., who goes on TPUSA tours and he talks about how the left is trying to shut down freedom of speech. And then he's dead silent on issues like this. Or if anything, he's not dead silent. He actually supports resolutions like this that basically cramp down on people's free speech because it's free speech he disagrees with. Either you believe in free speech or you don't. Free speech is supposed to protect speech that isn't very popular. And I see these people who categorize themselves as free speech warriors, and they're dead silent on these issues. It's ridiculous. Have you seen people like Dave Rubin condemning these things? Have you seen people like Ben Shapiro condemning these things? People who talk about how they believe in freedom of speech and the First Amendment in this country? No, you haven't. But your boy Nuance Bro will stand up for free speech every time. So that's the end of the video, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Social media links are in the description box below, as well as merch. Support the channel on nuancebro.com/join. We get demonetized way more often these days, it seems. So your support really does help. And I'm just going to leave you with this.
It's an honor to be here with the first Jewish president of the United States.